Welcome. What you're about to hear is the story of one of the deadliest, yet most forgotten crises of the 21st century Darfur. A conflict shaped by decades of neglect, resource wars, and ruthless paramilitary power. And strangely, it all resurfaced in global attention because of a single piece of misinformation, a reminder of how easily truth can disappear in the shadows of real atrocities. The satellite image appeared on X, formerly Twitter, on the 3rd of November 2025, posted by an anonymous user with a provocative caption. "This is the most disturbing Google Earth image ever." The user claimed the image showed a vast, dark bloodstain littered with the bodies of hundreds of victims from a recent massacre in Sudan. This shocking visual quickly went viral, viewed over 15 million times on X, becoming arguably the single most viewed piece of media concerning Sudan's devastating civil war over the past 2 years. The anonymous user's intent was to demand that viewers speak out about the ongoing genocide in the country. However, the image was profoundly misleading. While it was posted at the same time, an unprecedented massacre was unfolding in the heavily populated city of ElFasher. The image itself depicted an area in the much smaller town of Kumia, approximately 300 kilometers away from ElFasher. Furthermore, the satellite data from Google Earth indicated the image was captured on the 16th of March 2024, more than a year and a half before the events it purported to document. Even more conclusively, earlier satellite images from the exact same location, taken in 2022 before the civil war in Sudan had even started, showed the identical stain. The truth was far less sensational but entirely ordinary. The image simply showed a herd of cattle gathered around a watering hole, not a pile of human bodies and blood from a massacre. What makes this entire episode truly infuriating is that despite the falsehood of this particular mega-viral post, it is highly probable that the greatest crime of the entire 21st century did indeed just take place 300 kilometers to the north, in ElFasher. Yet, almost the entire world has either not heard about it or is actively ignoring it. ElFasher, the capital of Sudan's North Darfur state, found itself under the control of the Sudanese armed forces when the current civil war began in April 2023. Almost immediately, their rivals, the Rapid Support Forces, began laying siege to the city. This action trapped nearly all of the estimated 260,000 residents inside, half of whom were believed to be children. For the next 18 months, described as apocalyptic and brutal, the Rapid Support Forces steadily tightened their grip. They bombarded the city with artillery and drones, denied the passage of aid, food, or people in or out, and systematically weakened the population inside through famine and disease. More than 220 separate Rapid Support Forces assaults were launched during this period, leading UNICEF to describe the ordeal as a siege from the medieval era. In August 2025, the Rapid Support Forces began constructing a massive raised sand barrier, a berm, completely encircling ElFasher's perimeter. By early October 2025, the city and its 260,000 trapped residents were completely surrounded by this earthwork. They were contained in a small area of just 7 square miles, blocked off from the rest of the outside world. Throughout this horrific siege, experts and numerous observers consistently warned that the fall of ElFasher to the Rapid Support Forces would unleash an unimaginable massacre on the beleaguered population. The nature of the Rapid Support Forces was already well documented. In mid-2023, shortly after the civil war started, they captured El Geneina, the capital of the West Darfur state, and systematically murdered as many as 15,000 residents. Then, in April 2025, on their way to ElFasher, they overran Sudan's largest refugee camp, committing a similar atrocity, murdering over 500 people and forcibly displacing another 400,000. During the siege of ElFasher, the Rapid Support Forces rhetoric repeatedly portrayed the city's entire population, half of whom were children, as valid military targets who needed to be annihilated. These threats were ignored by the international community, which ultimately failed to act. Finally, On October 26, after 18 months of siege and near-constant warnings, the final positions of the Sudanese armed forces in El-Fasher were overwhelmed. The Rapid Support Forces flooded in from beyond the berm and immediately began carrying out what may well be the most brutal and horrific war crime of the entire 21st century. Enormous, ethnically targeted, and systematic door-to-door mass executions commenced. The scale of the catastrophe has been so immense that genuine pools of blood have been visible in subsequent satellite images captured over El-Fasher, even though the specific image posted to X was false. Other satellite images confirm the horror. One image taken on October 31 showed a pile of burned-out vehicles adjacent to the berm encircling the city. Perhaps most haunting are a series of images showing a former children's hospital. The first was captured over the hospital on October 26, the day the city fell. Just 4 days later, the hospital's entire courtyard was filled with white shapes, each measuring between 1.5 and 2 meters in length. Simultaneously, a fresh disturbance in the soil nearby measured between 5 and 6 meters in length. 3 days later, the shapes remained, and the excavation outside had widened to 12 by 8 meters. The following day, a layer of fresh soil covered the excavation area. This sequence suggests a single, terrible crime in a city filled with ongoing atrocities. The sheer scale of the killing in El-Fasher after the Rapid Support Forces takeover remains unknown. A communications blackout was imposed shortly after the city was overrun and continues to be in effect. However, analysts studying the Civil War suggest that the death toll is unlike anything else witnessed in the 21st century. Nathaniel Raymond, the executive director at Yale's Humanitarian Research Lab, suggested that more people could have died in just 1 week in El-Fasher after the takeover than were killed during the past 2 years of war in Gaza, where at least 69,000 people have been killed. If accurate, this scale of killing has not been seen anywhere in the world since the opening days of the Rwanda genocide in 1994. Yet, the world outside of El-Fasher, Darfur, and Sudan has barely heard a word about it. As the Rapid Support Forces continue their killings in El-Fasher and advance across the rest of the country, threatening similar horrendous ends, the world is doing precious little to stop the active horrors in Darfur, with other major conflicts in Ukraine and Gaza competing for international attention. To understand how to stop what is happening in Darfur, one must first grasp the region's complicated history. Today, Darfur is a region of western Sudan, bordering the Central African Republic, Chad, and Libya. Historically, it has existed at the fringes of both the Arab and sub-Saharan African worlds, experiencing centuries of migration, ethnic mixing, and intermarriage, making ethnic identity fluid and difficult for outsiders to parse. While modern commentators often simplify the conflict as one of ancient ethnic tensions between Arabs and Black Africans, this is not entirely accurate. An outsider visiting Darfur would not notice visible racial or religious differences between the warring sides. Everyone in Darfur, whether they identify as Arab or African, is equally Black, equally Muslim, and equally indigenous to the land. In Darfur, the identities of Arab and African are more based on linguistics and occupation. Historically, northern Darfur has been largely concentrated with a variety of Arabic-speaking nomadic tribes practicing pastoralism who identify as Arab. The south has been largely concentrated with a variety of non-Arabic-speaking sedentary groups practicing farming who identify as more African, with well-known groups including the Masalate, the Zagawa, and the Fur. The region of Darfur itself is named after the fur, roughly translating to land of the fur. It is important to understand that these identities are not rigid, and that the occupational identities between pastoralist Arabs and farmer Africans are often crossed. For most of the pre-colonial era, the fur were the dominant group, maintaining an independent sultanate for centuries, until it was crushed and conquered in 1874 by a Sudanese warlord, joining it into Sudan for the first time. Subsequently, Sudan was conquered by British and Egyptian colonial forces and transformed into a joint Anglo-Egyptian colony in 1899. The Darfur Sultanate was briefly restored and allowed to retain its independence in exchange for an annual tribute. However, during the First World War, the leader of Darfur aligned himself with the Ottoman Empire, provoking the British to invade, conquer, and annex Darfur back into Anglo-Egyptian Sudan in 1916. Thus, Darfur has only been a part of Sudan for just over a century. Throughout colonial and post-colonial Sudanese rule, since 1916, Darfur has remained a deeply rural, remote, underdeveloped, and neglected region on the country's periphery. Sudan came to be dominated politically, culturally, and economically by a relatively small group of Arabic-speaking elites in the Upper Nile Valley. Near the capital and largest city of Khartoum, virtually all resources and development were concentrated in this region, with little shared with the peripheral regions, which were largely made up of non-Arabs and/or non-Muslims. These groups, particularly in Darfur in the west and what would become South Sudan in the south, understandably felt increasingly marginalized. Darfur is a geographically huge region, comparable in size to Spain, extending across various climate zones. The northernmost parts are arid deserts within the Sahara, bordering Egypt and Libya. The center is a rugged, arid plateau dominated by the towering Mara Mountains, which provide abundant water. The south is a rich savanna environment that receives considerable rainfall. Historically, the northern parts were inhabited by camel-owning, Arabic-speaking nomadic peoples seeking grazing land, while the southern parts were inhabited by farming, non-Arabic-speaking sedentary people. For centuries, the northern Arabic-speaking nomads negotiated animal routes with the farming communities as they traveled south with their herds, a system legally sanctioned by the Sudanese government in the post-colonial era. In the 1980 seconds, this historical system began rapidly breaking down due to catastrophic drought and ensuing famine. As the climate changed, the supply of arable land began to shrink, and rainfall became less frequent and predictable. Simultaneously, Darfur's population was rising rapidly. This combination initiated a dangerous cycle where arable land along the southern rim of the Sahara was used more intensively to support the growing population, which, in turn, furthered the rate of desertification. In 1983 and 1984, the rains in Darfur failed completely. Desperate farmers in the south, facing crop failure, switched to animal husbandry and grazing. Desperate nomads in the north, faced with a shrinking supply of grazing land, moved south, leading to conflicts with the southerners. A devastating famine ultimately killed an estimated 95,000 people in Darfur between these years out of a population of just 1 million, implying about 3% of the population was lost. At the same time, the increasing competition over shrinking resources, like arable land and water, was being inflamed by a new sense of ethnic identity pushed by Sudan's elites and outside influences. Sudan's Arabic-speaking elites in Khartoum, who had long concentrated economic development in their own region at the expense of the peripheries, also attempted to create a unifying national identity based on Arabism and Islam. This greatly angered the non-Arab and non-Muslim peoples around the periphery. These policies especially inflamed tensions in the south of Sudan, where the people were neither Arab nor Muslim, leading to decades of massive civil wars and violence between the north and the south that resulted in millions of deaths. The conflict also led to steadily rising tensions in Darfur, as violence from the north-south conflict spilled over. The international borders between Darfur and neighboring countries like Chad and Libya are particularly porous, often existing only on paper. Many non-Arabic-speaking ethnic groups in Darfur, such as the Zaghawa and the Masalate, straddle the border with Chad, just as the Arabic-speaking groups in northern Darfur do. This means that conflicts erupting in either Chad or Darfur have a tendency to spread across the international border within these communities. This problem was particularly acute in the 1980 seconds amidst Darfur's famine, when Chad was simultaneously embroiled in a series of civil wars involving heavy military intervention from Muammar Gaddafi's Libya. Gaddafi, an ardent pan-Arab nationalist, was obsessed with creating a geopolitical vision he called the Arab Belt across the Sahel region of Africa. This belt would consist of statelets of Arabic-speaking peoples found across Chad, Niger, and Mali, separated from their countries, to create a continuous stretch of Arab-majority states from the Red Sea to the Atlantic. To support this goal, Gaddafi created a paramilitary militia in the early 1970s called the Islamic Legion. This militia was largely composed of thousands of impoverished Arabic-speaking volunteers from Chad and, especially, the nomadic northern communities in Darfur, all seeking money. Gaddafi deployed the Islamic Legion, along with a flood of weapons, to fight against the Chadian government throughout the 1980 seconds. The Islamic Legion exploited the porous borders between Chad and Darfur, using Darfur as a rear base to launch raids and attacks into Chad, which led to the proliferation of their weapons across Darfur. The Legion openly embraced an ethnic Arab supremacist ideology pushed by Gaddafi. After Libya's defeat in Chad and the disbanding of the Legion in the late 1980 seconds, many of their well-trained members returned home to Darfur, armed with both weapons and ideology, amidst the increasing environmental issues already pushing the region toward conflict. These returning former members of the Islamic Legion founded a new political bloc in Darfur called the Arab Gathering. This group continued to espouse an Arab supremacist ideology and claimed that the Arabic-speaking people in Darfur were being politically and economically marginalized by the non-Arabic-speaking African peoples in the region like the Fur and the Zagawa, despite Arabic speakers making up a majority of the overall population. In response, non-Arabic speaking African identifying communities began forming self-defense militias to resist them. Thus, identity divisions in Darfur that had once been local and ecological herders versus farmers suddenly became ethno-political and even racialized in a way they had never truly been before the 1980 seconds. Simultaneously, the central government in Khartoum, which also espoused an Arab and Muslim supremacist ideology, began arming and supporting the Arab Gathering and other Arab militias in Darfur to help retain control over the region. Small-scale violence between both communities began building, resulting in a few thousand deaths across the 1990 seconds, overshadowed only by the much larger fighting still raging between the North and the South. By 2003, after more than 21 years of civil war between the North and the South, and as many as 2 million deaths, both sides were exhausted in a stalemate. The Sudanese government, dominated by the Arabic-speaking elites of Khartoum, finally decided to enter into peace negotiations with the South to end the war once and for all. The resulting agreement ended the long-running North-South Civil War and paved the way for the South's eventual secession and independence in 2011. However, the agreement was heavily criticized for focusing only on the North-South conflict, neglecting Sudan's other peripheral conflicts, such as the one that had emerged separately in Darfur. Enraged at the repeated neglect afforded to Darfur and its problems by the elites in Khartoum, two rebel movements emerged in the region: the Sudan Liberation Army and the Justice and Equality Movement. Both groups demanded greater autonomy for Darfur from the central government and a redistribution of political power and economic resources. By April 2003, rebels from both groups began attacking Sudanese army bases across Darfur and scoring rapid victories, largely because the Sudanese army was still overextended and preoccupied in the south. Instead of diverting their army, the Sudanese government resorted to exploiting the recently emerged ethnic tensions in Darfur. They began arming the Arabic-speaking groups in the region to turn against the others, using them as their legal enforcers instead of the army. These Arabic-speaking militias in Darfur armed by the government and backed by regular army brigades and the Air Force, became known as the Janjaweed. They were sanctioned by the government to put down the rebellion in Darfur by any means necessary. Any village inhabited by the same ethnicity as a rebel leader, most often non-Arabs, was considered a valid target. Because the government could not reliably pay the Janjaweed fighters a salary like the army, they enabled them to loot and pillage at will for their compensation. The result was a devastatingly brutal crackdown in Darfur that briefly put the previously obscure region front and center on the world stage and the international agenda. Tens of thousands of civilians were directly massacred by the Janjaweed and their collaborators, while hundreds of thousands more are believed to have died due to the resulting famine and disease caused by their actions. In total, between 2003 and 2005, approximately 300,000 people in Darfur were likely killed as a direct result of the Janjaweed's actions. Satellite images from the time showed villages ablaze and clear signs of mass atrocities. A major advocacy group was formed in the United States called the Save Darfur Coalition to raise public awareness and pressure the United States government to take decisive action to stop the violence. This effort was backed by multiple influential celebrities. The resulting publicity and pressure contributed to the then United States Secretary of State Colin Powell formally declaring that the Janjaweed was committing genocide in Darfur in 2004. Around the same time, an inquiry by the United Nations concluded that there was irrefutable evidence of war crimes taking place in Darfur on a vast scale and urged the Security Council to refer the case to the International Criminal Court. A subsequent United Nations resolution demanded that the Sudanese government disarm the Janjaweed and halt their military flights over Darfur. A great degree of controversy arose over whether the events in Darfur at this time constituted the crime of genocide. To date, the United States government is the only government in the world that has actually declared the crisis in Darfur during that time to have been genocidal in nature. The United Nations formally concluded that while the Sudanese government's actions were brutal and deliberate, they lacked genocidal intent because the government's primary goal was counterinsurgency, not the deliberate destruction of entire groups of people. Others, like the United States government, disagreed, concluding that the Janjaweed was specifically targeting non-Arab groups in Darfur with violence. All of this gave rise to a unique term to describe the events: the ambiguous genocide. By 2006, the government and some of the rebel groups in Darfur signed a peace agreement. However, other rebel factions continued to fight, and the overall violence continued, though to a lesser scale than between 2003 and 2005. The Janjaweed continued to terrorize the population. The government, in turn, blamed the continued violence on the rebels who had rejected the peace accords and claimed, rather implausibly, that only 10,000 people in Darfur had been killed by all the violence taking place. The government initially refused to allow international monitors into Darfur and heavily restricted the flow of information coming out of the region. They vehemently opposed the United Nations' efforts to deploy a peacekeeping force, arguing that such a force would violate their national sovereignty. Eventually, in 2007, Sudan relented and allowed a joint African Union and United Nations peacekeeping force to be deployed to Darfur to protect civilians and monitor ceasefires. At the time, this was the largest peacekeeping force assembled anywhere in the world. By the 2010 seconds, the rebel movements in Darfur began splintering into smaller factions. Although the scale of violence declined, more than 2.5 million people in the region continued to remain displaced in refugee camps, out of a total population that stood at just over 6 million. The government would eventually declare the war in Sudan to be over by 2016. In 2017, the United Nations began scaling down its operations as the pace of violence continued declining, and by 2020, the United Nations mission concluded entirely. Despite the overwhelming evidence towards the scale of war crimes and atrocities that took place in Darfur during all of this time, hardly anyone has ever been legally held to account. This impunity has undoubtedly been a factor in those committing the current atrocities. Although the Sudanese government sometimes paid lip service to holding Janjaweed officers and commanders responsible for war crimes, no such officers or commanders have yet ever been brought to trial. Quite the contrary. In 2013, Sudan's then-dictator Omar al-Bashir formally elevated the Janjaweed militia from Darfur into a completely separate and parallel armed force in the country, which came to be called the Rapid Support Forces. He did this hoping the move would earn him their loyalty and enable him to play the Rapid Support Forces and the Sudanese armed forces against each other, preventing them from ever joining together to overthrow him. The International Criminal Court has done slightly better than the Sudanese government, but not by much. The court issued warrants for Omar al-Bashir's arrest in 2009 and 2010 on charges of crimes against humanity and genocide. But to date, the court has still never managed to apprehend him. Very recently, in October 2025, the International Criminal Court found one former Janjaweed commander, best known by his alias Kushe, guilty on 27 counts of war crimes and crimes against humanity committed in Darfur. However, he's the only person who has ever been brought to trial over what happened in Darfur more than 20 years ago. The only reason this happened at all was because he voluntarily surrendered himself to the International Criminal Court in 2020, fearing an even worse fate awaited him if he remained in Sudan any longer. Ultimately, Omar al-Bashir's strategy of playing the Rapid Support Forces and the Sudanese Armed Forces against each other failed by 2019. He was overthrown during a popular revolution that turned into a coup. The leader of the Rapid Support Forces, Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, better known as Hemedti, and the leader of the Sudanese Armed Forces, Abdel Fattah Burhan, then entered into a power-sharing agreement, with Burhan serving as president and Hemedti serving as vice president. 4 years later, after almost constant failed power-sharing renegotiations, the two men could not stand to share power in Sudan any longer. By April 2023, their rival armies finally began shooting at each other, and the current ongoing civil war in the country began. With all this context, it is crucial to understand that the current civil war in Sudan is not just a war between two power-hungry rival generals. It is also one between two fundamentally different heirs of the same regime that has dominated Sudan since its independence from Britain in the 1952. On one side is the Sudanese Armed Forces, led by the same kind of Arab officers from Sudan's longtime ethnic and political center in the Upper Nile Valley. On the other is the Rapid Support Forces, which is just the latest iteration of Darfur's Arabic-speaking ideological militias, drawing a continuous line back to the Janjaweed of the 2000s and Gaddafi's Islamic Legion of the 1972nd and 1982nd. Even before the current enormous atrocity in El-Fasher, the war between them across Sudan was probably already the worst ongoing humanitarian crisis anywhere in the world, surpassing the parallel tragedies taking place in Ukraine and Gaza. The United Nations declared that famine had become endemic in Sudan more than a year ago, back in 2024. Further United Nations reports concluded that some 25 million people in the country are currently facing extreme levels of hunger, while at least 12 million people have been forced to flee their homes, including 4 million who have fled the country altogether. By August 2025, a little more than 2 years into the fighting, the former United States Special Envoy for Sudan, Tom Perriello, reported that he believed the death toll from the war had exceeded more than 400,000 people. This was while El-Fasher was still under siege by the Rapid Support Forces, and the massacre there had not yet even happened. While the Rapid Support Forces and the Sudanese Armed Forces have been viciously fighting each other for power across the country with abundant war crimes, the Rapid Support Forces has also been furthering the ethnic-based terror in Darfur against the non-Arabic-speaking communities there that their Janjaweed predecessors began in the early 2000s. Many large-scale massacres of non-Arabic-speaking peoples in Darfur, such as the Masalate, perpetrated by the Rapid Support Forces, were well documented even before their siege of El-Fasher. For example, at El Geneina in 2023, They systematically killed as many as 15,000 people, including the local governor, in house-to-house massacres, and drove hundreds of thousands of others out after taking the city over. Throughout the entire 18 months that Fasher was under complete siege by the Rapid Support Forces, with more than 200,000, mostly non-Arabic speaking, Zagawa civilians trapped inside, the international community did little to actually stop what nearly anyone paying attention to this conflict knew would result in a catastrophic massacre if the Rapid Support Forces managed to break through. The United Nations Security Council issued just 2 resolutions that only called for a temporary ceasefire and an end to the siege at Fasher, without any concrete enforcement mechanisms to back them up. In early 2025, with the siege still ongoing, one of the Biden administration's final acts was to declare that the Rapid Support Forces was once again responsible for committing genocide in Darfur, just like their Janjaweed predecessors. This determination has been continued by the current Trump administration as well. Financial and travel sanctions have since been applied by the United States government on Hemedti and other Rapid Support Forces leadership, but none of these have caused any perceptible changes on the ground. Fasher was still ultimately overrun by the Rapid Support Forces. Now, potentially tens of thousands of people who were trapped inside, terrified for more than 18 months, are dead. The evidence of this has flooded the internet from videos taken by the Rapid Support Forces themselves and from satellites orbiting above in space. With the fall of Fasher, the Rapid Support Forces has been left almost entirely in control of the whole of Darfur. This means there is a very real prospect that Sudan may further balkanize between a genocidal Rapid Support Forces regime in power in Darfur and the Sudanese armed forces in power in the rest of the country. This leaves the rest of Darfur's non-Arabic-speaking minorities to the Rapid Support Forces' mercy, which, based on all prior evidence, simply does not exist. More massacres and brutality in Darfur are all but a certainty with the Rapid Support Forces still in power. If there is any silver lining from the scale of what just happened in Fasher, it is the fact that for the first time since this horrible civil war began in Sudan, the world's attention has briefly returned to Darfur. This presents a small window of opportunity to pressure a change before the situation inevitably becomes even more apocalyptic. The primary force enabling the Rapid Support Forces to commit their atrocities in Darfur is a key United States regional ally, the United Arab Emirates. The United Arab Emirates provided the Rapid Support Forces with the lion's share of their arms, finances, and political cover throughout the civil war. The United Arab Emirates is one of the wealthiest countries in the world due to its enormous oil resources, and it is also one of the world's top international arms customers. Between 2007 and 2014, the United Arab Emirates ordered more than $22 billion worth of conventional arms, mostly from the United States and major Western European states like France and the United Kingdom. In 2020, the United Arab Emirates entered into a massive, brand-new $23 billion arms deal with the United States, including modern F-35 fighters, Reaper drones, and billions of dollars worth of munitions. They have also doled out billions of dollars for additional arms purchases from France, Britain, Russia, and China. Crucially, huge amounts of these arms that the United Arab Emirates has been purchasing from around the world have been ending up in the hands of the Rapid Support Forces in Darfur. After the city of Omdurman near the capital was retaken by the Sudanese armed forces earlier this year, they reported uncovering an arsenal of hundreds of modern American-made Javelin missile systems and countless rounds of 155mm artillery shells that the Rapid Support Forces had abandoned. Verified footage of Rapid Support Forces fighters has shown them armed with American-made M4 and AR-15 rifles. British-made engines have been discovered in Rapid Support Forces armored personnel carriers, along with French and Russian weapons and Chinese drones. The advanced Chinese-made CH-95 drone has been frequently spotted in the hands of the Rapid Support Forces in Darfur recently, giving the group advanced military capabilities, like long-range reconnaissance and airstrikes. However, none of these countries have been directly supplying the Rapid Support Forces with these weapons. Instead, they are being funneled into their hands by the United Arab Emirates. A little over 2 years ago, the Wall Street Journal was the first major outlet to report on the United Arab Emirates' supply chain of weapons to the Rapid Support Forces. At the time, the journal alleged that the United Arab Emirates was flying cargo planes laden with weapons to a nearby airport across the border in Chad, bound for the Rapid Support Forces, and that the United Arab Emirates was disguising these shipments as humanitarian missions. In the spring of 2025, the Rapid Support Forces began experiencing a series of major military setbacks in their war against the Sudanese armed forces, culminating with their loss of the country's capital, Khartoum, in March. Following this, fearing that the Rapid Support Forces was losing the war, evidence suggests that the United Arab Emirates began rapidly increasing the pace of their arms deliveries to them. This has been reported by America's Defense Intelligence Agency and the State Department's Intelligence Bureau using battlefield and satellite images. In addition to their usual route of funneling arms through Chad, the United Arab Emirates has begun adding additional arms smuggling routes using cargo planes to Somalia and Libya, with land transfers directly to the Rapid Support Forces continuing from there. This rapid increase in arms from the United Arab Emirates in mid-2025 enabled the Rapid Support Forces to tighten their noose around ElFasher and increase the pace of their attacks and pressure, ultimately leading to the probable massacre currently being observed from space. Without the major arms sales that countries are making with the United Arab Emirates, which are then transferred by them to the Rapid Support Forces, it is doubtful that the Rapid Support Forces would be capable of continuing to fight or commit its countless atrocities. The United Arab Emirates is doing all of this because they see the Rapid Support Forces as offering the best odds at defending their own interests in Sudan. The United Arab Emirates is ultimately interested in access to Sudan's strategic Red Sea ports, its agricultural commodities, and, most of all, the country's rich gold deposits. Sudan is one of the most naturally gold-rich countries in the world, and the richest areas are located in Darfur. While gold smuggling out of the country is not new, it has rapidly expanded since the start of the current civil war. For the past few years, an informal and clandestine arrangement has been established between the United Arab Emirates and the Rapid Support Forces that sees weapons flowing towards the Rapid Support Forces and gold flowing back towards the United Arab Emirates. Gold from Rapid Support Forces run mines in Darfur is smuggled across borders in Chad, the Central African Republic, South Sudan, and Uganda, and then airlifted directly out to Dubai. In 2024, with the civil war raging throughout the year, the United Arab Emirates was Sudan's largest export market, with $1.6 billion worth of total exports, 91% of which was entirely gold. This gold also made up more than half of all of Sudan's exports. Gold has become one of the United Arab Emirates' most significant diversification strategies away from oil, which has seen Dubai transformed into one of the primary trading hubs in the global gold trade. The city is now home to thousands of gold traders and numerous gold refineries. Africa has become the country's primary source of gold. Gold imports from Africa into the United Arab Emirates nearly tripled over just a decade, between 2012 and 2022. In 2022 specifically, the United Arab Emirates imported roughly $59.5 billion worth of gold into the country, and 58% of that amount came from Africa. According to data acquired from SwissAid and released in 2024, this also meant that in 2022, almost 7% of the United Arab Emirates' entire gross domestic product was made up of imported African gold. A significant amount of that has been coming from the mines of Darfur under the Rapid Support Forces' control. However, the weapons that the United Arab Emirates is providing to the Rapid Support Forces in exchange for this gold supply are directly contributing to enormous historical atrocities, like what has just happened at El Fasher. Furthermore, The weapons that the United States and other countries are selling to the United Arab Emirates are directly contributing to it as well. The key to halting the Rapid Support Forces' ongoing massacres and brutality in Darfur lies in pressuring the United Arab Emirates to end their support for the group. That, unfortunately, is easier said than done. The United Arab Emirates is a major United States ally in the Middle East and is friendly and useful to Washington in many different ways. In addition to purchasing tens of billions of dollars worth of United States weapons and stuffing the coffers of United States defense industry companies, the United Arab Emirates has also committed to investing a massive $1.4 trillion into the United States over the next 10 years. In sectors like artificial intelligence, data centers, energy, and manufacturing. The United Arab Emirates hosts a major United States Air Force base in Al Dhafra, which is home to the United States 380th Air Expeditionary Wing, that has been used to support aerial missions in the region against ISIS and Iran. Moreover, the United Arab Emirates has been the most significant Arab power to date to join the Trump administration's Abraham Accords, normalizing their relations with Israel. They have also voiced their support for Trump's proposed peace plan in Gaza, piling pressure on the United Arab Emirates to cut their support for the Rapid Support Forces risks severing the lucrative gold trade flowing from Darfur. By extension, it risks jeopardizing the massive financial investments and arms purchases that the United Arab Emirates is making with the United States. It also risks the status of a key United States Air Force base in the Middle East. And perhaps worst of all, it could jeopardize the entire Abraham Accords by causing the United Arab Emirates to reconsider the recognition of Israel, which would risk upending what has so far been one of the Trump administration's greatest diplomatic victories. Nonetheless, the ongoing genocide that appears to be taking place in Darfur will not be stopped by the same kind of words, condemnations, and empty statements that the outside world has attempted so far. The only way that it stops is by actually interfering with the Rapid Support Forces' ability to kill. The only way to do that is by severing the supply chain of weapons flowing towards them from the United Arab Emirates. A combination of diplomatic pressure, sanctions, asset freezes, and suspending arms deals with the United Arab Emirates is the only possible way to achieve this. But because the United Arab Emirates wields such vast amounts of money and influence within the United States, it is unclear if the United States government will ever be able to actually muster the resolve to do what is necessary. The horrors currently taking place in Darfur today did not suddenly come out of nowhere. Just as the Holocaust did not begin in the 1940 seconds and the Rwanda violence did not begin in 1994, interethnic violence and genocides never begin in a vacuum. They always happen after years, or even decades, of building tension and warning signs. In Darfur's case, much of the origin for the violence taking place today goes back to Muammar Gaddafi and his influence over the region in the 1970 seconds and 1980 seconds. Gaddafi, perhaps the most eccentric and bizarre leader of modern history, was known for his flamboyant robes and designer sunglasses. His over 40 years in power in Libya were filled with memorable international moments. This included proposing the partition of Switzerland at the 35th G8 summit in 2008, after Swiss authorities arrested his son for beating his servants. It also included his attempt to pitch a massive tent in Central Park during a United Nations conference in New York City, and his possibly drug-fueled, hour-long rant at the United Nations in 2009 about finding John F. Kennedy's real assassin and calling for the United Nations headquarters to be relocated to Libya. He also launched an invasion of neighboring Chad to conquer territory, and in the process, fanned the flames of ethnic tension and violence in Darfur to achieve his own ends. Among his other conflicts with the United States, his global support for countless terrorist and militant organizations, as ideologically diverse as the Irish Republican Army and the Japanese Red Army, and his own ultimate war with his people in 2011 that led to a North Atlantic Treaty Organization, military intervention, and his gruesome, videotaped demise. He was, throughout it all, potentially the single most interesting and bizarre leader to have ever graced the world of geopolitics over the past half-century. Thank you for watching. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Tell us in the comments what surprised you the most in this video, or what you found the most fascinating. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Many more thrilling, shocking, and mind-blowing stories are coming soon.